The air was colder than Julian remembered, sharper somehow, biting at his skin like the edge of a knife. He pulled his coat tighter and stared at the familiar, unassuming, "Welcome to Silent Pines" sign at the edge of town. Its paint had faded over the years, but it stood defiant, a sentry to a place that hadn't quite moved forward nor crumbled into irrelevance. It felt the same but wrong, as though the years had shifted it into an uncanny reflection of itself. The town was quiet, blanketed by the kind of stillness that pressed against his thoughts. It had always been a quiet place, the sort where neighbors shared gossip under their breath, and main street traffic consisted of more pedestrians than cars. But now, even that faint undercurrent of life was missing. The stillness wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that made you second-guess whether you were truly alone. He parked his car outside the house that had once been his home, its silhouette etched in his memory like a persistent ghost. The windows were dark, the porch creaking softly under the weight of the wind. His mother had sold the place years ago after his father's passing, but the new owners had left it eerily untouched. Even the wind chimes, weather-worn and tangled, swayed from their rusted hook by the front door, a relic of a time when life here felt normal. Julian's investigation into Alex's disappearance was official, or at least that's what he told himself. But as he stepped onto the porch, it felt personal, as though the house itself held a part of the truth he sought. Inside, the walls seemed to breathe with the faint mustiness of neglect. Dust motes hung in the air, suspended in the weak sunlight that pierced the boarded windows. His footsteps echoed too loudly, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. As he moved toward the staircase, he felt it, a prickle at the back of his neck, an instinctual awareness of being watched. It was irrational, he knew. Yet standing in the entryway, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house remembered him, and it wasn't pleased. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself walking through the heart of Silent Pines. The main street was deserted, the street lamps casting long, distorted shadows over cracked pavement. The whisper started softly, carried by the breeze, too faint to understand but unmistakable in their presence. He froze. "Hello?" His voice sounded too loud, intrusive. The whisper stopped. Julian turned towards the woods, their silhouette a jagged black line against the moonlit sky. For a moment, the air seemed thicker, the darkness heavier. He shook his head, dismissing the unease. But as he walked back to his temporary lodgings, the whispers began again, faint but insistent, like an old song half-remembered. Julian found the trail by accident. The next morning, unable to ignore the gnawing feeling that the woods held answers, he ventured out. The trees loomed tall and silent, their branches intertwined like skeletal hands clawing at the sky. The ground was damp, the air cool and thick with the earthy scent of moss and decay. He recognized the path almost immediately. It had been their playground once, his and Alex's. The secret path, they'd called it, their personal portal to a world of adventure. But now, the once clear trail was overgrown, the forest reclaiming its territory. Branches clawed at his sleeves, and his boots sank slightly into the soft ground with every step. As he walked, fragments of memories flickered in his mind, laughter, the scrape of bark against palms, and the daring leaps they'd taken over the stream that cut through the woods. But something was missing, something just out of reach. Then he saw it. The tree stood at a bend in the trail, its trunk marked with a symbol he didn't remember carving. It wasn't the kind of mark two boys would make, not a heart, nor initials, nor a crude drawing. This was deliberate, a circle etched deep into the bark, surrounded by intricate patterns that spiraled outward. The air felt different here, heavier, almost expectant. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of nature falling into an uneasy quiet. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the grooves. The bark was cold, colder than it should have been, and his fingertips tingled as though the tree itself pulsed faintly beneath his touch. The memory came like a slap, vivid and sudden. Alex standing at this very spot, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Don't touch it," he'd said, his voice trembling. But Julian had laughed it off, running his hand over the carving before chasing Alex deeper into the woods. Julian staggered back, his heart pounding. The memory was too clear, too visceral, yet he had no recollection of it until now. How could he forget? The whispers returned, louder this time, weaving through the trees like invisible threads. He spun around, his eyes darting between the shadows. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking under the weight of fear. The forest didn't answer, but he felt its gaze, the heavy, suffocating sensation of unseen eyes tracking his every move. Gripping the strap of his bag tightly, he turned and hurried back toward town, the whispers trailing after him like a living thing. Whatever had happened to Alex, Julian knew now. The forest was keeping its secrets, and it wasn't done with him yet. The librarian was an old woman, her wiry hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the lines of her face. She looked up from her desk with an air of suspicion as Julian entered the Silent Pines library. The bell over the door jingled softly, the sound oddly muffled in the heavy stillness of the room. "I'm looking for anything about disappearances in Silent Pines," he said, his voice measured. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment too long, as if sizing him up. Then, without a word, she stood and shuffled toward the back of the library, her steps slow and deliberate. Julian followed, the old wood floors creaking underfoot. The archive room smelled of mildew and age, the air thick with dust. Stacks of brittle newspapers and crumbling books lined the shelves, their spines marked with faded dates. She gestured toward one of the piles. "Town history. If you're looking for trouble, it starts here." Julian nodded, taking a seat at the single table under a flickering light bulb. He leafed through yellowed pages, his fingers brushing against headlines that painted a grim picture. "Boy vanishes without a trace. Couple lost in forest, never found. And local teacher missing, presumed dead." The disappearances stretched back decades, each case eerily similar. Ordinary townsfolk vanishing near the woods, leaving behind no clues. But what struck Julian most was the frequency. Every few years, like clockwork, someone else disappeared. People used to call it the woods taking its due, the librarian said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, almost reverent. A warning passed down from the old families. They knew better than to wander too deep. Julian's throat tightened. "You're saying the woods are alive?" She gave him a look that sent a chill through his spine. Alive? Number but aware, perhaps. And what it's aware of, well... Her voice trailed off. The mention of the forest seemed to unearth something in her. She began recounting stories of strange lights seen at night, voices calling from the trees, and paths that changed direction without warning. "People like to forget," she said, her tone heavy with resignation. "It's easier than facing what they can't explain." Julian's mind raced. The carving on the tree, Alex's disappearance, the whispers, it all seemed connected, yet he couldn't piece it together. His eyes fell on a drawing tucked into one of the newspapers. It was a crude sketch of the same symbol he'd seen on the tree. "This," he said, holding it up. "What does it mean?" Her face paled. "That's the mark of the echo circle, a place where the past doesn't die and the present can't escape." Before he could ask more, she stood abruptly and left, muttering something about closing early. Julian sat alone in the dim room, the air around him colder now, charged with an unshakable sense of dread. The path twisted in ways it hadn't before. Julian stood at the edge of the woods the next morning, staring into the dense thicket. The trail he remembered as a child should have been straightforward, leading directly to the stream. But now it veered sharply, snaking through trees that seemed closer together, their trunks warped and leaning like crooked sentinels. The whispers started almost immediately, faint and disjointed, like fragments of conversations carried by an unseen wind. Julian pushed forward, each step heavier than the last. The air felt thicker here, tinged with a faint metallic tang that made his stomach churn. He didn't recognize these parts of the forest, though he knew he'd been here before. The memories were just out of reach, like a word on the tip of his tongue. As he walked, he noticed things that shouldn't have been there. A child's shoe half buried in the undergrowth, a rusted bicycle tangled in roots, and the remnants of an old campsite. Each artifact felt wrong, like they'd been placed there deliberately. He stopped at the stream. The water, once clear and babbling, was now sluggish and dark, its surface reflecting the dense canopy above. Across the stream, he saw it again, the tree with the carving. But now the symbols seemed deeper, the grooves raw and fresh, as though it had been etched recently. The whispers grew louder. Julian froze, his breath catching in his throat. Across the stream, something moved, just a shadow at first, darting between the trees. It didn't make a sound, yet he could feel its presence, its attention fixed on him. He took a step back. The shadow flickered again, closer this time, its shape indistinct, but undeniably human. A chill ran down his spine as he realized it wasn't alone. More shadows appeared, emerging from the trees like smoke coalescing into forms. They didn't move toward him. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough, a silent warning that resonated deep within him. "Alex," he whispered, the name slipping from his lips before he could stop it. The shadows froze. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, Julian thought he saw a face in the darkness, familiar yet distorted, as though viewed through rippling water. It disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving him staring at the empty woods. He turned and ran, the whispers chasing him like a living thing, their words still incomprehensible, but laced with urgency. By the time he broke through the tree line and into the open air, his chest heaved, his hands trembling. The forest watched in silence, its secrets safe for now. Back at the edge of town, Julian sank to his knees, clutching the newspaper sketch of the echo circle. The shadows, the carving, the whispers, they weren't random. The forest wanted him to find something, but it wouldn't give up its secrets without a price. Julian stared back at the woods, their dark expanse stretching endlessly before him. Whatever had happened to Alex, he knew the answer lay within, and the forest would make sure he found it. The forest didn't wait for Julian this time. As he crossed the threshold into the trees, it seemed to pull him in, the path beneath his feet narrowing and twisting with unnatural purpose. The air grew heavier, colder, the faint hum of whispers wrapping around him like a shroud. He tried to steady his breath, but the forest pressed closer, its branches arching overhead to block out the light. Each step felt deliberate, as though the ground itself was guiding him. The familiar symbol carved into the trees began to appear more frequently, etched deeper, their grooves oozing a dark, sap-like substance. The sight turned his stomach, yet he couldn't look away. The patterns spiraled outward, intertwining with smaller markings that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. When he reached the clearing, the forest fell silent. The echo circle lay before him, a perfect ring of trees encasing a hollowed ground. Their twisted roots emerged from the earth like gnarled fingers, circling the space protectively. In the center, the soil was black and wet, glinting faintly as though it were alive. He hesitated, his heart pounding against his ribs. There was something waiting for him there, something ancient and unknowable. The air buzzed with anticipation, the silence so complete it pressed against his ears, deafening. "Alex," he called, his voice hoarse. The ground inside the circle shimmered. At first he thought it was water, rippling gently as though disturbed by an unseen force. But as he stepped closer, he saw faces, countless faces, etched in the dark earth. They weren't clear, just vague impressions of eyes, mouths, and hollow cheeks shifting beneath the surface. The whispers returned, louder now, but no longer fragmented. "Come closer." The words weren't spoken aloud. They resonated within him, vibrating deep in his chest. Against every instinct he obeyed, his steps slow and hesitant. The circle pulsed faintly, each beat in time with his racing heart. The moment he crossed the threshold, the forest seemed to exhale. A faint wind swirled around him, carrying the earthy scent of decay. The ground beneath his feet felt soft, pliant, as though it were no longer solid. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, his voice shaking. The response came not in words, but in a vision. The forest around him dissolved, replaced by a memory. His memory, though it felt foreign and distant, as if filtered through someone else's eyes. He was a boy again, running through the woods with Alex at his side. They were laughing, breathless with the thrill of discovery. But then the scene shifted. The laughter faded, replaced by a low, resonant hum. The boys stopped, their smiles faltering as the forest around them darkened. The air grew heavy, and the whispers began, faint and insistent. Julian's younger self looked to Alex, who stood frozen, his eyes wide with fear. "Don't touch it," Alex whispered, his voice trembling. But Julian didn't listen. He reached out to the tree with the symbol, his fingers brushing the grooves. The moment he made contact, the forest erupted in sound, a cacophony of voices, each one pleading, crying, screaming. The memory fractured, dissolving into darkness. Julian staggered back, gasping for air. The vision left him trembling, his skin cold and clammy. "What do you want from me?" he cried, his voice breaking. The ground rippled again, the faces in the soil shifting to form one he recognized instantly. Alex. His friend's features were pale and distorted, his expression pleading. "You broke the circle," the voices said, layered and ancient. "You let the echo free." Tears blurred Julian's vision as he knelt, his hands trembling over the dark soil. "How do I fix it?" The air grew colder, the whispers fading to a single voice. "Remember." In a rush of clarity, Julian understood. The forest hadn't taken Alex. It had trapped him, locked in the echo circle as penance for their trespass. And now, it demanded a balance. Julian placed his hand on the ground, the dark soil cold and pulsing beneath his touch. The forest shuddered around him, its branches groaning as the echo circle pulsed brighter. The whispers rose to a crescendo, then abruptly stopped. The clearing was empty. The faces in the soil were gone, and the forest was silent once more. Julian stood, his heart heavy yet strangely calm. The path back to town was clear, the trees no longer twisted but upright, their trunks strong and steady. As he stepped into the open air, the whispers returned, not malevolent, but soft, almost grateful. The echo circle had taken what it needed, and Silent Pines was at peace again. But as Julian drove away, the forest lingered in his rearview mirror, its dark expanse stretching endlessly. He knew it wasn't over. The echo never truly sleeps.